So let's start with just the pure basics here. And I'm gonna point this one to you, Seth. So for those that don't know out there, what exactly is a CMS?
CMS is a content management system. Some people think of Drupal or some of these other large scale ones as a content management framework, very extensible. You can build many different things with them, but essentially it's just a platform for housing and editing, creating, distributing content, most notably as a website.
All right, and so there's a lot of different kinds out there, and then today's talk is around open source versus proprietary. So what is the difference between those two?
Well, open source is when you can look into the code that creates the platform or the website, but also that you can modify it. And generally there's a notion of community behind it, that this is not created by one single entity, not all the time. Sometimes an enterprise will open source their proprietary software. So it's no longer proprietary, but generally there's some sort of community where you can contribute to the code base of the platform. Whereas proprietary, generally you can't see the code, that's locked down. You don't have visibility into how it runs, and you certainly can't contribute to it as an outside member.
Got it. So let's dig into the kind of the benefits of each types. What are some of the kind of pros and cons here of open source?
Well, like I said, you can easily or freely try it, use it, modify it, redistribute it. You've got this community behind it, which helps not only vet the utility of the platform and increase its effectiveness, but also it's a security it's a security measure too. The more eyeballs you have on code base, the more likely you're going to get someone who points out a bug or whatnot. So there's just lots of code level and security level benefits. You also have open standards, that increase transparency, faster fixes, fewer bugs. You can see them all here. You don't have the vendor lock-in. So for example, you go to a big company like Oracle and they have a proprietary CMS, then you're locked in, right? You have to pay their vendor fees every year. They can increase their prices at any time, right? So that's one big thing. Whereas open source, you get it for free. Essentially, you might have to pay for some plugins here and there, but generally those are low priced. They're monthly or a one and done fee that is much more predictable. No IP restrictions, simple license management, they scaled and extended.
And how about if we're talking about proprietary software? What are some of the pros and cons to consider with proprietary?
Yeah, proprietary, well, let's think of pros. I guess the pros are if you really trust or have a solid relationship with the company, maybe you're familiar with their developers or their in-house team, or they have a really great security track record. They've been around a really long time, and you can just kind of trust that they're not going to make mistakes in the future, that they're not going to have a dev team that is degraded or gets less effective over time. But I'm having a little bit trouble finding pros of proprietary over open source. I guess if the open source, contrasting individual projects, if the open source project itself is not well supported, of course, then you don't want to buy into or start using something that is not well maintained, that doesn't have the community behind it. For example, in that instance, if there's not a viable open source alternative, then proprietary makes more sense, right? But otherwise, a well-maintained, highly supported open source project tends to offer more benefits in terms of cost, security, all that, than proprietary. I will say, sometimes the level of support from an open source community might not give you a certain level of user experience. We work with HubSpot, for example, which is a marketing platform, and it's just so complex and ever changing that there just hasn't, we haven't seen a marketing platform out there that has surfaced to rival HubSpot in terms of usability, user experience, ongoing growing feature set, so that's one example where proprietary just makes more sense. It's just the open source community can't deliver or hasn't delivered a solution that's as usable, as current, as complex.
I'll just tag on to that to say that in open source, I mean, one of the benefits of it is that it is, in fact, can go in a lot of different directions. Any number of people who want to contribute to it, anybody from the community can jump in and create, help shape the overall development of the open source platform. And that can be really good, but it also can get somewhat unruly to some degree. You get a little bit, it's very, very democratic, but then you potentially also have some chaos around the edges of that, potentially with a proprietary platform. If it's solid, if it's built on a really good code base, you typically have a development team, you've got a history, you've got a vision behind it. To some degree, the fact that it is narrower, that it is limited, that you don't have everybody jumping in and you don't have a lot of cooks in the kitchen can mean that it can be engineered to be a little bit more straightforward, feel a little bit more polished. Again, that's highly subjective. There's some very polished open source software. I mean, WordPress being an example of that as well, and for that matter, Drupal as well. But the example of HubSpot is really apt. It is very user-friendly, feature-rich, extensible in some ways, but it is not an open source platform. You can't just invite everybody into the party and start messing with it. On the other hand, HubSpot then gets to control the overall direction and evolution of the platform, hopefully to the benefit of its users. So you're trading freedom for a certain amount of maybe creative oversight by the people who develop the software. And that can work to your advantage, but it can also work to your detriment.
So you mentioned WordPress and Drupal as those are the two most popular open source platforms. What are some examples of proprietary CMSs that are out there?
Yeah, there's there's Sitecore, there's Kentico, there's Adobe had Expression Engine. I forget what the latest name of the platform is these days, but there's tons of them. There's just tons and tons and tons of them, and you'll get into situations. Okay, Adobe, for example, that's going to be well supported. You're going to have a developer community that knows how to work in that platform, for example, so that you don't have to hire someone from Adobe, but rather a developer who knows, who works, for themselves, or an agency or whatever, who knows how to work for that platform. But since there are so many, you'll get these really specific, like random CMS for higher education, and you'll almost have to pay the company and their developers because there's no other developers that know how to work in that platform. Or the developers that you do hire will have a long learning experience to get ramped up and familiar with the platform or the language that they use. Sometimes they'll use esoteric languages, where programming languages that just aren't common today. So you have to think about who is going to be supporting this thing and what's their on-ramping time to support it. and things like this.
Yep. So it's almost like a SaaS that you're licensing. Would that be a correct way to describe it?
Yeah, it is much more, it's similar to SaaS. You know, ideally, these things are more extensible than a typical SaaS platform. They'll give you an API, or you can code in, you know, templates, you know, adjust the templates so that you can make your website more your own. But yeah, the customizability and extensibility does vary among these platforms. It's really a mixed bag. Yeah, you get CMS as a service, and then, you know, sometimes it's really hard to make things look and act like you want if it's a proprietary platform.